I think I'm caller 10.
I'm glad you're here, by the way, because before you ran for governor and while you were on the Port of Seattle, you were very active in combating homelessness.
Yes.
As I have been. We were focusing on different parts of the problem in different places. And you actually were like the night manager one day a month for one of the shelters.
I am. St. James runs a winter shelter for men, and in 2004 I started volunteering as an overnight manager. And once a month I would run with another person the shelter between 7 p.m. and 7 a.m.
Okay.
And then I went back doing that after the gubernatorial campaign and spent the last winter helping out again.
So we seem to be at a historic moment, it seems to me, in the city of Seattle, a turning point where you actually have the business community forming a coalition with neighborhoods, the business community, large and small, neighborhoods who are tired of all these illegal, unsanctioned homeless encampments popping up all over the place. A deliberate policy of not enforcing civility laws, which means we have outbreaks of uncivil behavior. Here's a story in this morning's Seattle Times about 3 violent attacks, unprovoked, inexplicable attacks on people by violent homeless people. And the reaction from the city is, oh, that's so rare. I know this is very embarrassing, but it's so rare. And you get the feeling that this issue is galvanizing the people of Seattle. And you're involved in opposing the South Lake Union shelter the way the city wants to put
it's not a shelter. It's a shack cluster, a cluster of shacks.
The city's aspiring to a Hooverville.
Yeah, I think that kind of gives Hooverville a bad name. As you said, there's a lot of neighborhood organizations that are trying to combat homelessness in their neighborhoods. 2 of them that I met during the campaign one's the Neighborhood Safety Alliance and the other one's Safe Seattle. These are organizations that are trying to combat homelessness in Ballard, Magnolia, and down in Soto. They've come together to form a group called Unified Seattle, and they're opposing this shack cluster that's going to be proposed or is actually likely to be built over behind the Courtyard Marriott at the base of Queen Anne. And they asked me to come out in opposition to it. And I said, well, before I come out against it, let me go see what it's all about. And the model for this new shack cluster is up on Aurora at Licton Springs.
Oh, we've talked about that place.
Yep.
That's a homeless camp where they allow you to use drugs. They pass you out needles.
I don't think I didn't see them pass. Do they?
No, they do.
I believe
they distribute needles.
Listen, this is not a model. When you look at just the 911 calls that are going into the police station and 911 after the opening of that camp, they have gone up anywhere from 30 to 60%. The neighborhood is not happy with it. There are some people up there supportive, but I talked to a lot of people who are not happy with it because of the impact it's having on their lives.
Who up there supports it?
Oh, you're going to have a few neighbors, and if you read the Seattle Times article, there's a few people saying, oh, it's a nice idea. But look, this is not how we want to help people. When you look at this cluster of shacks, if you go visit it, these are shacks that are about, let's call it 6 to 8 feet wide, maybe 10 feet deep. They have electricity, but there's no running water. If an apple grower were to build that and put their farm workers in there, they would be considered inhumane. And what the city of Seattle is doing... Would it even be legal? It would not be legal. And what the city of Seattle is doing is building these little shacks that would not be legal under any other circumstances, putting them behind a chain-link fence, putting placards and posters up on the fence so no one can see what's going on in there, and you're allowing people to use drugs. You're not helping them get off drugs. You're not helping them find permanent housing. This is the end game.
Okay, wait a minute.
These folks have moved into these little shacks, and they have no intention of moving out.
If it's illegal for an agribusiness to allow that kind of housing on their property for farm workers,
how can it be legal for the city of Seattle to do it? Oh, on the other hand, John,
well, how
is it legal for the city of Seattle to condone heroin use?
Well, that's the other thing.
Now we're building villages where you get to use heroin. You can't have a straw. You better not have soda unless you got a lot of money. But we're going to get you heroin.
Yeah, that's right. You're not using trans fats in that heroin, are you? No, that's a very fair point. Everyone or the Seattle City Council gets vexed about plastic bags. but not about, plastic baggies with heroin in them. I mean, it's just really, that's what would upset them is does that plastic bag have heroin in it? Not anyway. You get
the
my
Seattle City Council is the problem. All right. I think what happened here is that they just were embarrassed over this cluster of a head tax, and so they want to be seen doing something. The mayor wants to be seen doing something, so they're going to open up a shack cluster at the base of Queen Anne, South Lake Union, up behind the Marriott. They'll have a ribbon cutting. It'll give them a chance to issue a press release. Look, we're opening up they'll call it a village. It's not a village. It's a cluster of shacks.
Right.
And it won't solve the problem. We have a city council who's spending more and more money, has nothing to show for it, and so they're going to try and roll out some new little village. Well, in reality, you're not helping people. You're warehousing them there. And this is not a solution. It's just a bunch of shacks.
Well, and when people say, the solution is housing, more housing, I say, wait a minute. The solution is answering the question, what do you do with a homeless drug addict who doesn't want treatment and who doesn't want to stop using and doesn't want to stop illegally camping? Now, the far left will say, we'll just give them shelter anyway, which means that
the city council needs to recognize, and I know this from working in shelters.
We're already a magnet for
and
drug users.
We need to acknowledge that some people do not want to live in a shelter. Okay, and that's a decision they're making. That's their personal decision, but they have no right to camp out in public property.
And until the city enforces that, I mean, I've been writing this for Crosscut in the Seattle Times and other places, until the city addresses that central reality, that the real problem is not enforcing laws against illegal camping, against litter, against drug use, against being drunk or high in public, against using vacant lots and sidewalks as restrooms, against in-your-face panhandling, until the possession of stolen property. I mean, we could go on and on. Until the city enforces those laws, things won't get better.
No, and the state needs to step up too. We have a mental health system which is ranked somewhere between 47 and 50th for adults.
Yeah.
If you have a broken mental health system, you're going to have homelessness. Mm-hmm. Our foster care system is a mess. You're 17, 18, you've been bounced around for, a dozen homes, and now you're just thrown out there with no support system. One study shows that 30% of those kids are going to end up in one of these camps. If they don't have a drug problem, when they go into that camp, spend 3 weeks in there, and they will.
Yeah, they'll have one in
So the state needs to step up and fix our foster care system and our mental health system. The city needs to do everything you're saying. The problem is, John, we have no leadership on this issue. You've got a lot of people who want to throw money at it, but you have no one who's really coordinating a state and a regional and a city approach.
Okay.
We got whack-a-mole, and this is exactly what you're seeing right now. The city just kind of whacking one little problem, another one's going to pop up. There's no leadership. All they think that they need to do is spend more money, and they're wasting millions of dollars.
Yeah, well, no, they spent money making things worse. They spent literally billions since 2005. Billions, and the homeless
they have
problem
nothing to show for it.
They do 50% worse.
Okay, fine.
It's 50% worse than it was.
Building clusters of shacks behind chain link fences is not a solution.
Okay, so specifically, what would you do next? We know how the people of Seattle feel about this. We know they've hit the wall. We know they're done. They want to get rid of this council. They were going to get rid of the head tax, and the city beat them to it. The city council beat them to it because they were afraid of the anti-tax momentum. So the very tax they unanimously supported, a tax on employment of $275 a head for large businesses, they repealed 7-2 less than a month later. So with that momentum, with that mood currently existing, what's the next step?
One, you have the zero tolerance on camping in public property. It's not allowed. Number two, then you've got to have places for people to go. And so you need to build shelters that are actually going to help people get off the streets, not enable them to continue to stay there. There's a good example, John, down in Olympia. It's called Quixote Village. Quixote Village really is a tiny house village. It's secure. You have to be a member who's living there in order to get in.
Public or private?
It's a public, with a lot of private money. The land was donated, but it's a public operation.
So it's run by the government?
It's a public-private sector partnership. They are tiny houses, and they're legitimate tiny houses. They're tiny. They're not too much bigger than the shacks, but they have running water. They have a toilet. They have a little porch. They're clustered in a circle, so it's very much like a little village. Everyone has to work. They got to have a job.
Everyone has to work.
They have to work, and they will find them a job, and 1/3 of their salary goes to pay their rent for the little house. They also have all kinds of counseling available to help people put together a resume, get a job, figure out what mental health or drug addiction counseling they might need. So this is a real model for what the city of Seattle could be doing.
Can you be an alcoholic or a drug addict and live there?
You can't be using drugs and alcohol while you're in there. So if you have a drug or alcohol problem, they will get you counseling and they'll put you on a rehabilitation program.
So you'd be in a different facility. Okay.
But these clusters are just shacks for everybody to go into.
So we know that Pete Holmes is in no hurry to enforce these laws, to prosecute people for breaking these laws. He's really the unsung part of the problem here. We know the city council is in no hurry to have these laws enforced either.
Well, and they're not in any hurry to begin enforcing any requirement on accountability and performance. If we actually looked at how many people are moving out of these shack clusters into some sort of permanent housing, I think it's well under 20%. So that's not success. That's not spending taxpayers' money well. Right. We need to only fund those programs that are actually focused on lifting people off the streets.
So with the next elections in Seattle a year and a half out, what should we do until then to make things better?
Well, the first thing that I think people need to do is let the city council know that this type of shack clusters are not an acceptable solution. And they haven't gotten that message yet.
No, and they're not going to.
Well, I'll tell you, there's a meeting this Thursday night between 6 and 7:30 at 415 Westlake Avenue, and the city wants to hear what the people think about these shack clusters. The people ought to go and tell the city what they think about these shack clusters.
They've been more and more willing to show up, so that's a very good point.
There's a website, unifiedseattle.com, where people can get information about the meeting this Thursday night. Unifiedseattle.com. It's the organization of organizations that are dealing with this issue.
We just had the city council do something that it didn't want to do, repeal the head tax, in response to a ballot measure. A referendum campaign to...
Well, they didn't want it on the ballot this fall. That's why they did it.
So, maybe the answer is another ballot measure. What would you like to... Because we know that the city council is not going to do a 180 on where we know they are. I mean, if anything, they would go further. They would allow camping in parks if they could get away with it.
Do you remember not too long ago, Bryant had a measure which would allow people to park on, not camp, park, whatever, on sidewalks?
Yes.
You had miles of sidewalks designated for camping areas.
This is where they are ideologically. So if we know that referenda or initiatives work, what would you propose in the way of a ballot measure?
Well, given that you've given me all of, 20 seconds here to think about it, what I'd love to see is a statement from the people of Seattle that they do oppose camping or living in public spaces, whether that's an off-ramp from the freeway or your neighborhood park or just the sidewalk in front of your office building. Why don't we ask the city council to enforce that law?
Let me float an idea by you, and I'll get your response, and we're out of time. What about a ballot measure that says it shall be illegal to park an RV on a city street overnight?
Sure. I mean, unless somebody's got an RV that they just got back from Lake Chelan, they legitimately have it parked in front of their place.
Well, no, if it's in front of their residence or if it's in their driveway, it's one thing. But on public streets, just say no RV parking.
Well, we've got to get rid of these RV campgrounds down in Soda, which are just a cover for prostitution and drug dens.
You're exactly right. But you see, I don't think it's going to happen by putting public pressure on the city council. I hate to say this. I don't think it's going to work with Jenny Durkin either. I think it has to be compelled by a change in law that requires the enforcement.
Well, I'm not going to disagree with you. I'd love to see that, but the fact is we have laws right now that aren't being enforced. So creating another law against RVs isn't going to do any good if Holmes doesn't want to enforce the law.
Stick around. We'll round out the first half of the hour. And then we have a lot of other things we got to cover here in the last 30 minutes of the John Carlson Show, Talk Radio 570 KV. I want to thank our sponsor this portion of the show, 3010 Weight Loss for Life.